in the right room and do some basic expectation management. The aim of this panel is to give an overview of the deployment and development of the technology in the field of law enforcement and migration management. We will discuss what these technologies have in common with existing, more long-standing surveillance infrastructures. And we will also look at the impact on people, and especially marginalized ones like migrants and racialized communities, going merely beyond the data protection and privacy concerns. And so for this discussion, I have the great honor of having by my side some of the best human rights and digital rights activists and researchers whose work is tremendously important. For that, I'm very grateful they accepted the invitation. So tonight we will be speaking with Amba Kak, Director of Global Strategy and Programs at the AI Now Institute, which is part of the New York University. And the Institute is producing research on the social implication of artificial intelligence. Hello. Alina Smith, who is Advocacy Officer at PICUM. PICUM is the platform for international cooperation on undocumented migrants. Then we have Chris Jones, who was appointed Executive Director at Statewatch just last year, actually. And for those who don't know, Statewatch is monitoring the situation of civil liberties in Europe, and in particular at the European Union level, the member states, and also in the UK. And it often provides crucial information and documents related to the justice and home affairs issues. And then lastly, we have Petra Molnar, who is a lawyer and researcher specializing in migration, technology, and human rights at the York University of Toronto in Canada. And she is also a former Mozilla Fellow working with EDRI. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to, for the speakers and the audience, I'm here to just present some housekeeping rules or just present the format of the session. I'm aiming for fluid discussion as much as possible. So for that, even if I have a script that is ready to kind of guide the discussion, I'm encouraging the speakers to ask for the floor and intervene whenever they feel like and they want to react to what is being discussed. No problem for me. And for the audience, please feel free to use the chat and to ask questions, share remarks. I'll try to keep an eye on this kind of chat box and ask or share the remarks with the speakers whenever they are relevant. And in any case, we'll try to reserve some time at the end of the session, like a 10 minutes for Q&A. And so this session will be broadly divided in two parts. We'll first start to map the development of data-driven technologies, including AI systems in the field of law enforcement and migration management. But also we'll look at how they're interrelating with law enforcement data collection and data sharing instruments. And in the second part, we will try to discuss like the opportunities to contest and resist to these developments and ways to combat this science fiction collectively, as the title of the session invites us to do. Okay, let's start with the first question and with this kind of first scene setting part. I would like to start by giving the floor to Amba. The AI Now Institute started investigating police data-driven policing and notably predictive policing, what kinds of AI systems are being used at the moment by law enforcement, notably in North America, because I know that you're also looking at Canada. And for you, what are the major problems in the use of these technologies by the police today?
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you so much for putting together this panel. Like you mentioned, we are a research institute, but a lot of our policy work, which is what I lead, focuses on kind of creating legal and policy resources that can be used for advocacy as well as for governments and other key stakeholders in the policy space. So our work on policing in particular, I'll say at the outset that much of that has been led by my colleague, Rashida Richardson, my former colleague. And so I'll talk a little bit about the work that she's done on predictive policing, and then explain how we continue to work on these issues more broadly and also with a global and comparative lens. So, I mean, predictive policing is one, obviously, among a suite of other technologies that we've looked at in the criminal justice system, including risk assessment tools that determine or that sort of algorithmically determine bail decisions or sentencing decisions, as well as looking at biometric recognition systems beyond just facial recognition, but focusing on that quite a bit in the US, and the use of biometric recognition systems as an investigative and policing tool. And then finally, like you mentioned, predictive policing systems, which just for the benefit of the audience, I would describe as the use of algorithms to analyze data and then produce a forecasted probability of where a crime may occur, who might commit it, and also in some cases who the victims of these crimes might be. Now, about I think your question was why do we work on this? I think as an organization that's committed to studying the social impacts of AI, it seems that in the US context in particular, predictive policing has really been the kind of paradigm case to demonstrate that data is not and has never been neutral. And this conclusion is a very powerful one, not just in the criminal justice context, but it has feet across the use of AI or other data-driven systems in social domains. And I think it has the potential to be quite disruptive, to use a tech industry term, to the premise of a lot of the marketing and just general kind of branding claims that have supported the proliferation of this industry, and particularly its use to commodify risk and risk management. Now, so let's put that data is not neutral in the context of the criminal justice system, and we can see that it encodes very many human decisions, right? So the decision of when to stop and frisk a person, the decision of when to report something, when to arrest someone, where to prioritize police resources, where to over-police, where to under-police. So many, discriminatory and historical laws, like drug laws in the US in particular. So we're seeing that the data is kind of coming out of this environment and is almost inevitably not just replicating, but kind of reproducing those patterns in the way that it's used. And so what is really has been, I guess, the most damaging fallout of the proliferation of these tools is that then the results of these systems are almost used to prove that, yes, in fact, social disorder is connected to certain groups in society. And these are the same groups that have, borne the weight of cumulative and historical disadvantage, which makes it, I would say, particularly pernicious. And in that way, I think it's both a continuity of historical problems and discriminatory patterns, but it is in some ways exacerbating them. And maybe just quickly, because just to focus a little bit on the research output which Rashida led, it was called Dirty Data, Dirty Policing. And in some ways, I think its main contribution is really a method of how to demonstrate discriminatory intent and discriminatory outcome. So what they, her work focused on the use of not just wrong data, but also misrepresented and biased data that was informing predictive policing tools across the US. And she examined 13 US police jurisdictions that had already engaged in illegal, corrupt, and biased practices and subsequently built or acquired predictive policing systems. And she found that in 9 of those 13 jurisdictions, there was a very high risk that the system's predictions were actually, reflecting or reinforcing the biases that had been embedded in the data, whether that meant frisking the very same localities, making sure there was chronic over-policing just in particular precincts, which then led to higher crime rates and then reinforced the need for over-policing of those very areas to the exclusion of other, particularly other white neighborhoods or other kind of neighborhoods that weren't already being over-policed. So that's to give you an example. I don't want to spend too much time, and I think we should sort of open it up, but just to come out of the US context a little bit, because that's a lot of what my work tries to do at AI Now. I'll give the example of in 2019, before the pandemic, we were invited by the European Parliament Libe Committee public hearing on AI in criminal law and its use in Europe. And I remember that when we were asked to do it, the kind of pitch was, since issues of racism are very much prevalent in the US and there have been a lot of issues there, could you please talk to us about some of these concerns? Almost as if these were not issues in the European context. And so as much as we came to talk about all of the issues that had been demonstrated in the US context, I think we drew on the work of, for example, Sarah Chander and Petra at EDRI and Petra's work as well as a report. I might forget the name wrong, but I think it is an ENA report that was on data-driven policing in Europe, to try and say that these issues are not particular to the US, and how can they be, because they are obviously implicating any place that has a kind of has structural injustice, and I think no part of the world would be exempt from that. It is likely, if not inevitable, that it is those same injustices that will get reified or reinforced by this particular technological imagination that just seeks to kind of, objective or so-called objectively quantify these problems and then act and then kind of build tools to deal with them on a quantitative or technical paradigm rather than a broader and more holistic response. So I'll stop there.
That's a great introduction. It's perfect. It's setting the ground for everything. Like police agencies, they are not the only institution that actually resort to AI systems or data-driven technologies. In the field of migration management too, we see this kind of pattern of relying increasingly on so-called innovative solutions to support the mission of these authorities. Alyna, how are those new technologies and data collection techniques used by immigration enforcement authorities? And do you have any examples? And for you, how does it translate for the lives of undocumented migrants?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chloe. So I think maybe it's helpful to start just with a brief note about context. So how do we understand the relationship between migration policy and policing? I mean, these might seem like quite disparate areas. But of course, an undocumented person is anyone like you or me. But from the point of view of the authorities, the distinguishing characteristic is their right to reside or to work in the country. And so the approach to dealing with a person who's undocumented in Europe, and I'm sure elsewhere, is one of essentially mirroring criminal law. And so there's a very, very close relationship between immigration enforcement and policing. And so on the one hand, we have efforts at the EU level and the national level to deter people from arriving irregularly. And we have efforts to also identify people already present in Europe with irregular status using various techniques. So there are kind of two ways in which PCOM has been trying to follow and engage on these issues around, shall we call it, policing. And one that we've been working on for a long time, long before we knew what the GDPR was or talked in terms of data protection, was the free exchange of personal data between the immigration services of different member states and other sectors. And in the context of this, we've been advocating for what we call firewalls, basically trying to end that free exchange of personal data. So, there are examples of this we hear anecdotally from many of our members, but there are also examples of countries in Europe where this is systematic because of existing legislation. So, for example, if you're an undocumented person in Germany, the good news is that you have a right to limited healthcare under one piece of legislation. So that's a positive thing. But the bad news is the same government body, the same authority that you would go to get covered care has a legal mandate under the Residence Act to inform to transfer data about you to the Immigration Service. And so as a consequence, undocumented people, by and large, don't access healthcare in Germany through the national health system. And so we see a similar relationship in the UK, where for a number of years now, there's been regulations around charging people who are overseas visitors or who don't have indefinite leave to remain for secondary care. So it doesn't mean you'll be turned away from care necessarily, but you'll be eventually charged for that care. And if you accrue debts up to a certain amount, I think it's £500, then there will be a systematic exchange of data, a systematic communication between the National Health Service and the Home Office, which is the immigration service in the UK, which of course has an important impact in terms of health-seeking behavior for undocumented people. So these are long-standing practices, and we see it also in the case of access to justice for undocumented people in countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, and elsewhere, where even if you're a victim of mistreatment or crime, or you're a witness and you want to approach the authorities to report, there is often systematically communication between the police and the immigration service about you, which of course also deters people from coming forward. This happens also in the labor context, and the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights has written about severe labor exploitation and has found that 57% of migrant workers surveyed said they don't report severe labor exploitation because of fear that it will lead to deportation. So there are examples of countries that take another approach. So Belgium, while it doesn't do it for criminal justice, for victims of crime, for at least undocumented workers experiencing exploitation, there is this notion of professional secrecy, where labor inspectors try to operate a bit independently of police authorities. So that's a longstanding issue and a longstanding concern for us. I maybe briefly end on the question about borders. So we came to the world of data protection when the GDPR came into force, around the time the GDPR came into force a couple of years ago, and we wanted to understand how it relates to our work and advocacy. And that helped, that we got the tools, in that work and in that exploration to start to dig into actually regulations that were passed barely a year later, that essentially create massive interconnected databases with the dual purpose of addressing irregular migration and also addressing serious crimes like terrorism. So already we can see that by design, this enormous information technology architecture is discriminatory in singling out foreigners, whether they're asylum seekers, people applying for short-stay visas, third country nationals who may have a criminal record, and so on and so forth, and putting all these things together in the same bundle under the shared umbrella of serious crimes and immigration enforcement, as if those things had some kind of relevant connection, which of course they don't. So it's deeply stigmatizing, and we've been really trying to follow these developments, but it just shows again the national security, immigration policy conflation that really drives the enhanced use of massive data processing and use of technology that also feeds into immigration control measures.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, there are like those intrications between several aspects of those developments are very hard to grasp for us. And we'll come back to this in a few minutes in the second part. It's already really interesting to hear from you. I would like to turn to Petra to complement a little bit this kind of scene setting, because you conducted a research for over a year collecting migrant stories in Belgium, but also at EU borders, notably in Greece. What type of technology did you witness being used on the ground? And for you, what does the EU plays a role in the deployment in such technologies? And what consequences did you see for the people there?
Thank you for having me, Chloe, and for giving me the opportunity to talk about our work a little bit. Like you said, the research and the story collection that we've been doing for over a year now, and we're actually spinning it out into a broader project that we're calling the Migration and Technology Monitor. Really, the idea is to highlight the systemic nature, this kind of ecosystem or panopticon of surveillance technologies, automated decision-making, AI-type technologies, and how they're manifesting themselves in a variety of ways at and around the border. And also, looking at these issues from a systemic perspective. How are politics playing a part, and how does the private sector and the centralization of some of the big actors that we all talk about in this space, how do they play out in the kind of decision making and the prioritization of what matters? When we were trying to understand the issue from the systemic perspective, again, we take a broad look at the technologies from this angle, trying to understand what happens before a person even crosses a border when it comes to data collection, all sorts of automation around population movement prediction and things like that. Issues at the border, for example, the now infamous border control project that purported to discern whether someone was telling the truth based on facial recognition type technology and various risk scoring. And then issues kind of beyond the border, automation, automated decision-making in a variety of applications. This is actually where my work started on this in Canada, trying to understand how AI was making its way into visa applications. But really what is becoming clear is that we are dealing with a class of technologies that is operating in this opaque space of decision-making at and around the border, which already, from a legal perspective and a human rights perspective, presents many issues. A human immigration officer, or rather 2 human immigration officers might be looking at the exact same set of evidence, and they will make 2 completely different determinations. Now, when we start augmenting some of the decision-making by new technology, what will this look like? And we just don't know. The laws, the regulation, the policy making is just inadequate to really capture not only how these decisions affect people's lives, but also how they harm them. And, just to pick up on what Amba and Alyna were saying, it's important to look at some of these broader trends, both from a historical perspective, but also from a political perspective. We are dealing with rising xenophobia, with increasing criminalization of migration. And again, whose priorities really matter? Oftentimes, it's powerful actors like states, like private sector, and really that is something that we need to pay close attention to. And the last thing I'll say is I'll pick up on that point about the European Union. One of the most worrying issues that we've been trying to draw attention to is, again, this creation of what we've been calling a technological testing ground, or how certain communities are experimented upon when it comes to technology. And the EU plays such a major role here because, of course, the idea of Fortress Europe isn't new. But what is new is this increasing reliance on a variety of technologies, and also this kind of push to externalize European borders, or push the border further and further away from the geographic physical location of Europe. But then, we've also been seeing, and of course State Watch and others have been doing great work on this as well. We've been witnessing how the European border space has changed from a physical embodiment of the border towards a more virtual surveillance state that now is making its way into northern sub-Saharan Africa and further afield. So really what we are dealing with is this expanding panopticon of technologies that not only does it impact individual decisions, but it also exacerbates systemic racism, discrimination, is very, very harmful for people's experiences they're moving. And again, this kind of experimentation on communities that are already on the margins is something that's quite troubling.
Excellent. Indeed, so we can already see that all the actors have started embracing this kind of expansion of surveillance tech, and notably embracing the expansion of the industry and its products. That's also notably the case of the EU and its member states, as we just heard. But the use of those kind of sophisticated technologies might just be the tip of the iceberg in terms of the broader police surveillance apparatus. I'd like to ask Chris, the EU has been for several years now developing kind of significant infrastructure of surveillance in the field of law enforcement and migration management, notably in the forms of databases. Chris, do you see the relation between the expansion of these databases and in general the increasing collection and sharing of data for law enforcement purposes? What are the trends between the two with this development of new technologies in the EU?
That's quite complicated. Well, I suppose I mean, to start with the point that this idea of the conflation between, as Alina was saying, between migration and crime, or migration and terrorism, which has kind of become the stock phrase of the people in the European Commission's Home Affairs Department now, and many other interior ministries around Europe and elsewhere, I'm sure. I suppose one problem we have really, which applies to all kinds of data collection measures, is that if it's there, then the police want it. You know, back in probably around 2006, 2007, this is just after the system called Eurodac, which collects the fingerprints of asylum seekers, was just come into use a few years before. And there was officials from the European Commission saying, you know, don't worry, this could never possibly be used by the police. This is very sensitive data on a very potentially vulnerable group of people. And, you know, there's no reason it would ever be handed over to law enforcement agencies. Fast forward about 5-6 years, and they handed it all over. Well, they didn't hand it all over to law enforcement agencies, but they made it possible for the law enforcement agencies to access that information under certain conditions, etc., etc. And what's kind of interesting about that story, I suppose, is that when it became possible for the police to access this information, having spent a very long time, you know, Interior Ministry representatives, police officers saying, we need this, it's very important, you know, who knows how many cases have been we haven't solved because we haven't had access to this information. A few years later, they released the statistics from it, and they barely accessed this information at all. Most member states had never used any of that information. So I suppose the question there is, I mean, obviously they're very hungry for any data they can get their hands on, even when it doesn't seem to be of any practical use or purpose for them, as far as we're able to know. But that hasn't stopped this idea that the police need access to immigration information becoming a sort of standard feature of every new database that is developed by the European Union. As Alina was saying, there's this plan to merge all the databases into one big system, which will be accessible for immigration and policing purposes. And all the databases that are having their information merged as part of that already have this possibility. You know, that there's a database of visa information which is accessible by the police under certain circumstances. There will be a database of border crossing information which will be accessible by the police. So, you know, there's a very obvious trend that has developed, and that trend is to gather more data from more categories of people and to make it more readily accessible to law enforcement agencies for certain purposes. You know, the EU, I suppose this has been a big topic in the EU for the last few years because it's been a series of new developments, but I don't think the EU is necessarily a world leader in this. I was sitting down doing so the kind of thing I do for fun is compare which databases visa applicants to the US get checked against compared to what happens when someone wants to visit the EU. And the list in the US is, I mean, as long as your arm, it's huge. So really the EU's kind of following on, you know, is keeping up with the Joneses, which I guess is one of the problems we need to grapple with. And I don't want to sort of skip the conversation too far ahead, but you know, the question is if the US or Australia or whatever country it may be has this, then every advanced state also determines they need that as well. So yeah, it's kind of it's an issue of, you know, being up there with the most advanced states, using the most advanced technology in this sort of, I don't really want to use the term arms race, but, you know, there's certainly, like I said, a need to keep up with the Joneses. And how we can sort of address that dynamic is, I think, a very difficult question. But I think that's probably to come in the discussion, so I won't jump ahead.
Absolutely. And this is actually one of the problems. There is way less public scrutiny over those kind of infrastructures or databases. And Amba, for example, you recently took the example of what you called criminal intelligence databases, and you analyze gang databases in the US. Those are nothing new, nothing that could be called new technologies, but they can be considered as the kind of first stage in the creation of more high-tech AI surveillance systems, like the trendy things we get to know a bit more about, like biometric surveillance. The problem is that with those databases, they already include all the kind of racist bias we already talked about from the very start, and those biases are very much linked to the stigmatizing and criminalization of entire communities. Amba, can you tell us more about the thought process you had and that led you to take into account the digitalization of those databases?
Yeah, let me get my, can you hear me? Okay. No, thank you so much for that question, Chloe. And I actually, just what Chris said was really resonant in many ways. So I'll try to connect the two. Our work on criminal intelligence databases actually was inspired by the fact that we noticed that in US discourse, but I have noticed this more broadly as well, including in India, is that right now, because there is an industry buzz, but also on the flip side, the kind of civil society resistance to AI and predictive policing is quite heightened. And as a result, we're finding that tools that don't have the word AI in it, or aren't so-called advanced, or don't claim to predict anything, but are just, you know, ordinary databases, or so it is we're meant to believe, are kind of falling by the wayside of public attention. And this matters because, you know, as a result of, I would say, almost a decade now of advocacy, we're seeing that there have actually been, you know, there are statements like predictive policing systems are racist, dismantle them. They're part of this broader movement towards both immigration and criminal policy reform that is ongoing in this country. But I would say more broadly, it seems like, you know, that resistance is also having its moment. And so our argument was to say that we need to stop putting technical thresholds as to what technologies are included in this moment of resistance and what are excluded, because it seems like a lot of what governments are using across the world, and indeed in a cross-country basis, are actually forms of databases. And I would actually maybe challenge the understanding that they are just a step on their way to becoming predictive tools. I would say instead that they are used in very much the same ways. So rather than think of them as foundational or rudimentary or kind of intermediate, we would argue that criminal intelligence databases, and we've studied them, we've studied gang databases in the UK, the US, and a form of that known as the habitual offender register in India, to basically argue that these are historical systems, these are legacy systems that are actually being used in many of the same predictive ways as predictive policing. And that is not to say that nobody should talk about predictive policing or other kind of you know, science fiction type of tools, but only to say that these kinds of legacy systems, if we can call them that, or these databases should not be left out of that purview based on an ambiguous technical threshold. So that's I guess the first point. The second thing I just wanted to say is just on, I mean, this sort of echoes what the speakers before me have said, but there is this deep connection between digital policing and digital methods and modernity or advancement and economic development is also, I've actually seen that manifest in really terrible ways, because what is happening across the global south now is that policing departments are, again, being sold complete hogwash, things that they could never implement because their data systems are just not in place, but they want to be seen as an advanced country. And today, being an advanced country means that you are using XY technical tools and your policing system has been digitized. No matter what, you know, level of infrastructural readiness you have for those reforms. So just taking a broader view, I think what we're seeing is necessarily should be a comparative conversation, and it should build solidarities, because different activists and civil society organizations are seeing different, you know, they're seeing this beast from a different lens, but I think they could benefit from a broader resistance that kind of calls out these systems, both for the fact that they don't work, but also that when they do work, they are bound to, or there is already evidence that they will only entrench marginality and will only entrench social problems through the lens of criminality, which I think the speakers before me explained really well.
Indeed, it links very much this kind of explanation where law enforcement authorities, like in general, authorities are very hungry for any kind of data or any kind of like super hype cool tools. This is kind of a trend. I think I'd like to ask a last question on this part and then move to the second one. To Petra, in your report, you're also talking about an ecosystem of technologies. Why do you think those is the same? Again, it's we talk about an ecosystem where different type of technologies and then databases, AI system interact. Why do you think they form an ecosystem at EU borders?
Thank you, Chloe. Yeah, I mean, we were quite deliberate with the terminology, and I think we liked the term ecosystem because it is a more expansive way of trying to understand how this all fits together. And again, we need to think about these issues from a historical perspective, from the fact that certain communities have historically been made marginalized and have been facing systemic racism, discrimination, exploitation, and is now tied to this kind of obsession with innovating at and around the border, even though, like we've already been discussing, the space of decision-making is very opaque, very discretionary, difficult to understand when you have humans making these decisions, let alone, you know, this increasing automation and surveillance that we are seeing. So again, the idea that this is all also tied to the priorities of the private sector really does play into this as well, because it exacerbates this kind of all-encompassing net that ensnares communities that have historically been made vulnerable. And again, the way that this plays out needs to be contextualized, which is something that Alyna mentioned. The fact that we are talking about migration management technologies, which are then oftentimes superimposed upon different technologies in the criminal justice system or predictive policing, this all plays into the fact that we are dealing with communities that are at the sharp edges of technological development, ones that we have somehow rationalized as being worthy to be experimented upon, even though we are dealing with a system that is unregulated, insufficiently discussed when it comes from a harm reduction perspective or even a rights protecting perspective. And that's why we try to conceptualize of things from this more kind of ecosystem or broad way.
I would like to move on to the second part now. Now that we kind of like try to describe a little bit what's going on in those two fields. Let's try to look at the solutions and the opportunities we have as academia engaged in this topic, but also civil society organization activists on how to resist to those developments. And I would like to ask Chris, because you did a really important work. You've worked on the interoperability of EU migration and law enforcement database that we were just mentioning just before, which is a legislation that is typically very niche and at the same time lies at the intersection of several policy fields. And what you notice is very limited public attention, press coverage, and even political debate about these developments. How do you explain this? What did you found in this kind of report? And what do you think are the limits and for civil society organization to just reshift their focus and take into account all the aspect of those kind of policy initiatives? Is that clear?
Yeah. I mean, it was a very interesting piece of research we did, and we asked a bunch of people, knowledgeable people in Europe, about what they thought about this process of the European Union adopting this legislation on these interoperable databases. And I mean, three main points came out of it, I suppose. The first is that the term interoperability is horrible jargon. It was all this technical, or rather a political process disguised as a sort of technical activity. You know, the public communication was, well, all we're doing is making it simpler for people to access the information they already have access to. That was not true, and the purpose behind it was to build, as Alina said, this giant database, merging all this different information, giving access to far more people than would have had access to it previously. So one issue, this is one issue, is that it's a very technical problem, and even when you break it down to, there's going to be a giant database, I suppose there's also a level of perhaps public fatigue on these issues. I mean, the data story is everywhere, and particularly when it's data that primarily 99% concerns non-citizens, unfortunately a lot of people are less likely to take an interest in it, and it becomes less easy to sell to editors at newspapers and so on and so on. So there's this sort of problem of, it's technical, it doesn't affect citizens, people think it's not my problem, I'm just going to dump it over there, and that's that. Secondly was the issue that what we wanted to find out was whether there was much discussion or knowledge about this at the sort of national level, in the national public spheres. And the answer is there was basically no or very little press coverage, parliamentary discussion, even the parliamentary committees that, were supposed to scrutinize this legislation. It basically got pushed down the lists until it was just sort of signed off with no meaningful debate about what happened. So the conclusion there is there's this big gap between national democratic procedures, which are the democratic procedures which remain closest to most people, and what goes on in the European Union institutions. Again, that's not really new. I mean, it's the Brussels bubble problem. It's a weird little world full of its own jargon, terminology, and it's very hard for a lot of things going on there to break out more widely into the public consciousness, especially again with something that is in some ways relatively niche. The question about getting organizations to work on these topics, I suppose, is that there's a lot of organizations that work on related topics to this: digital rights, data, privacy. And the ones we spoke to, I mean, the general issue was, they even knew about it and didn't have time to deal with it. It wasn't on their list of priorities, or in some cases they didn't know about it at all. And I don't think that other organizations should be, changing their priorities because of what we think is important. But I guess, I mean, the place to start at least is that for there to be more discussions about these topics, these issues, and what what's going on that affects an entire continent basically, and hundreds of millions of people, which in this case is the size of this database is supposed to go up to around 300 million people. That's an awfully large number. So yeah, I mean, for me, the place to start is sort of conversations and discussions, and at least sharing that information with the people who are in the know and are perhaps able to work on this. That's kind of where we have to start, I think.
Absolutely. And yeah, what you're saying is completely resonating, even with my personal own story, if I may. It's when I joined EDRI, I talked about the interoperability legislation as part of my interview for an internship. And I said, I really want to work on this. And unfortunately, EDRI had at the time no resources, either human or financial, no time to work on this legislation, and we didn't cover it, although we are a Brussels-based organization. So that's really telling already.
But it did get you a job.
It did get me a job, although I never worked on it, which is funny. I would like to ask Alina more specifically, what are the barriers that you face as a civil society organization specialized in migration to follow and to engage in those type of topics, in those type of policy initiatives that are at the intersection of law enforcement, technology, data protection, discrimination, etc.?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges is precisely what we've just heard from you and from Chris, is that we have digital rights organizations, we have migration rights organizations, and issues like interoperability just fall in the gap between. Because I think it's fair to say that migration rights organizations haven't historically really closely followed developments in the areas of digital rights. And I think it's also worth noting that I think historically, and this is changing, I think, in the European context, but digital rights organizations don't necessarily have a lot of experience working on issues around the impact of digital rights on very specific groups like undocumented people, for instance, or migrants more generally. So I think, you know, when I started reaching out to people 2 or 3 years ago on these issues, I really saw this gap, and that even digital rights organizations at the time who saw the importance of this didn't necessarily understand what this would mean for undocumented people or for migrants, because there's just a kind of, it's not an area they necessarily have familiarity with. So I think that's a huge challenge. And certainly from our experience, I can say it was a big step for us to step outside of our comfort zone, to start looking at GDPR and fundamental rights issues around data protection and privacy. Like, we follow migration policy, which is already a very, shall we say, active file, demanding a lot of attention and response at the EU level. We also follow, social rights, children's rights, victims' rights, and so on. So we follow a lot of different policy areas. And digital rights brings us, I mean, there's enormously important overlaps, but there's different legal frameworks also. So like with interoperability, there's 2 massive regulations, 50 pages or something each. So I think exactly what Chris has said, like dialogue and reaching out and getting to know organizations that are familiar with those legal frameworks, with the kind of analytical approach or concerns that would normally attach to certain types of technology, and then having conversations about what this means for groups that we understand, that are in our domain of experience and expertise. That has been so important. I think another important challenge has been translating the relevance of this to people. So it's one thing to understand the technology, the thing that's happening and why that's problematic. It's a whole other thing to speak about the impact and what this means for people. And I think that's been a big challenge for us and something we continue to work on. We've been trying to develop different tools to begin to kind of do that in the best way we can for our membership and our partners. But how to go from talking about the technology to talking about what it means practically, concretely for people, that's a whole other step. And that's really where I think it starts to resonate with people at the national level, people really working in these fields, like this is what it will mean for you. And I think one other thing just to mention is that it's sometimes challenging to talk about these issues in the context of migration, because of course a lot of the whole impetus behind this is efficiency, right? We want to increase the efficiency of our migration machine, our deportation machine, I should say. And of course, who doesn't like efficiency? And so we're trying to show the problematics of these systems, basically driving like scaled up databases, scaled up data processing. But if you already kind of don't understand or see the underlying discriminatory aspects of the existing system that we're trying to increase the efficiency of, then that's very challenging. So I actually think the more we work on this, I actually see the critical importance of actually working on these issues of data protection, digital rights, with a view to actually say more about and to shine light on and bring visibility to those underlying problems that are actually the profoundly discriminatory systems that are being augmented and ostensibly made more efficient, even if we actually doubt that will even happen either. There's a lot of mythology around what's achievable. So yes, I think there's an opening and an opportunity that we need to seize to use these frames as best we can as a lens to see the broader systemic discriminatory problematics kind of in the underlying policy domains. whether it's policing, migration, and so on.
This is maybe something that you share, Amba, I guess. I think that maybe it resonates a lot with what you also see. I think you wrote a piece last year about the limits of data privacy, or the data privacy approach when addressing the use of AI system for policing, and including this failure to move beyond just the technology and you know, how can we address the impact on marginalized communities that are overly affected? Why do you consider that data protection lens or laws are not enough to counter this discriminatory abusive surveillance? What are their limits?
Yeah, thank you. I think one thing I'll say at the outset is that before I joined AI Now, I was very much part of it'll seem weird to outside people because these issues are all in the realm of tech policy, but I was in the bubble of the data protection world, like the bubble that in real life would be everybody that comes to CPDP. So I was very much, and still am obviously, committed to data protection as an instrument of technology policy reform and a really key part of information regulation. But I think one of the things I learned very quickly moving into AI Now and sort of expanding the scope of the work that I was working on is that often the focus on data and also the focus on data protection as an aspect of privacy seems to distract from or really cut off more systemic thinking. The kind of conversation that we are having today, for example, at least I would argue is rare in the data protection world. And the reason for that is because we're we're limited through the lens of the law. As path-breaking and revolutionary as the GDPR has been and its offshoot has been globally, at the end of the day, we are trying to see every problem through the law rather than trying to analyze the problem and see what parts of it might be addressed by data protection law and what parts might fall by the wayside. And so I think that kind of, I forget the name, but the kind of the blinkers that we have on are not always helpful. So that's the first thing. And I think similarly, the other sort of blinker that is common in this field is the idea that we are still talking about fixing technology. So I think Ruha Benjamin said, we're not trying to fix racist robots, we're trying to fix racist society. And that goes to Alina's point that the groups that we're trying to forge solidarity with or forge coalitions with may not be part of this technology and immigration or technology and criminal justice system. They will be criminal justice or racial justice groups. They will be immigration justice groups. They will be, many resistance groups who themselves have decentered tech, because that is not the relevant lens. So I think for all our work, that is a lesson, and a lesson for those of us that have access to more interdisciplinary researchers and activists to try to bring our expertise and our understanding of the technology and see where it fits in to these broader movements. And so maybe in short, to decenter ourselves as people that are more firmly, or I'll speak for myself, more firmly at the intersection of technology and these social movements. And maybe just to end a sort of like warning of something I noticed in the US, which was when we had over the course of 2020 massive protests and abolition calls to really defund the police in the United States. It was almost immediately that we saw people, different police departments, including the NYPD, argue that, yeah, defunding the police is a great idea because we need less real human beings policing and more technology. And so they would use the same budget to procure more technology. And I think that's a warning for the rest of the world. And to your point, Lina, on efficiency, that efficiency logic goes very deep. And it, again, is going to be used in ways that we can't even predict to hijack some of these broader conversations that are actually, definitely their idea of utopia is not that we replace all policemen with CCTVs or with smart cameras, right? So that's maybe I'll end there to say that we need to be always watchful for the ways in which then technology is weaponized in these broader debates.
Oh yes, I think none of the activists behind the defund the police would think that they actually got more algorithm on the end when they reach that goal. I don't think this is their goal. I will ask Petra the same question actually. So, since you conducted your research on the ground, what do you think the role of civil society, but also academics, researcher, is to address and raise visibility of these issues?
Thank you, Chloe. I mean, I'd like to start off by saying it's such a fascinating discussion to have, because even just in terms of my own positionality, I actually come from not the tech sector at all. I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer by training, and I was very much outside the tech bubble. And it's been fascinating to try and understand how it all kind of fits together, both, as someone who has not operated in this kind of data protection technology field for very long, but then also, what are the missing perspectives and the missing questions that we are not asking? And it's so heartening for me to hear that abolitionism is making its way into the conversation, because I think, like Amba said, it's important and crucial in this particular moment in time to have conversations about the harms of technology and the abolition of certain technologies. And I think part of what we really need to learn from and center in these discussions are the experiences of affected communities and groups. Not just as kind of a tokenization exercise, which sometimes happens in the digital rights space, no offense, but I've been seeing that quite a lot, kind of as an afterthought, we should probably talk to some people who've lived through this. For us, what we're trying to do at the Migration and Technology Monitor is something different, is to start the project with the mindset of participatory action research and actually learning from people who have had the lived experience of being at the sharp edges of the technology. What do they think are the priorities? How do they construe recommendations? And how can we all learn from each other as we're trying to grapple with these really complex issues? And this is, I think, where that kind of deep solidarity building and the kind of interdisciplinary work really comes into play. And for me, I'm constantly learning every day from the people that I have the privilege of talking with, and the very strong opinions that they share about the technology and the way that it's affecting them and affecting all of us. And again, I mean, I think this kind of broader discussion that we need to have cross-cuts not only disciplines, but it cross-cuts lived experiences as well, and the kind of priority setting that happens, whether you look at it from a funding perspective, academic research perspective, even conferences like CPDP and the types of panels we are able to have and the types of attendees and panelists that are able to make it. These are all conversations that I think we need to have in this digital rights space moving forward.
Great. I think we're having the hand of it. We have 15 minutes left. I don't know if Amba, you need to leave now. I would like to get a sense of your ability.
I'll have to jump off, Chloe, but
okay, great.
Yeah, I will have to jump off, but this was a really great conversation, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for contributing, and see you soon. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.
We have 15 minutes left, and I want to open the floor for question again, and repeating that, you can use the chat. And there is a first question, I think, addressed to the entire panel by Jesper Lund, also member of EDRI. Do you predict, Jesper asked, do you predict a greater public interest when the collection of biometrics in border control context and subsequent use by law enforcement will affect most citizens, so not only people in marginalized, vulnerable situation at the borders of the EU? He is talking hypothetically, if the EU, the US, and other countries start exchanging biometric data in the framework of the entry-exit system, creating biometric databases of almost everyone, do you think it will be then too late to act? Who wants to take that one?
I want to ask if you put plants in the audience, Chloe. Did you invite Jesper?
No, I swear I didn't.
Well, I'm here, so I'll say something, if that's okay. Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to think that people would be more concerned when this came to affect them. And there are certain measures that sort of in this vein that have already affected European citizens. You know, in 2006 or 2007, it became law that you had to have biometric passports. And more recently, any country that has a national ID card, that has to be a biometric ID card as well. But this is my understanding of how those sort of processes have worked out is that, you know, some people are deeply upset by it, but they are a minority. And most people, unfortunately, you know, tend to go along with these things. So, I mean, this is something I often wonder if you know, these are not the issues that are going to spark a mass democratic uprising. So there have to be other ways to sort of challenge them, perhaps more, I don't know, more discreetly or more intelligently. And I think it's different depending on the type of biometric data you're talking about. So, you know, people feel a bit differently about one fingerprint stored in a chip inside your passport than they do about facial recognition systems being deployed in the street, or, you know, voice recognition systems potentially being, you know, I think Gordon Brown, the former UK Prime Minister, once suggested sticking microphones on lampposts so we could hear potential terrorists plotting, because they obviously all do it under lampposts in the street. The plan did not get a good reception. So it also depends what kind of particular technology we're talking about. Yeah, so, you know, there's, yeah, like I said, there's a difference between a fingerprint and your face being scanned as you walk down the street. So I suppose it depends case by case. The idea whether it'll be too late by the time people get interested, I mean, I don't like to think there's ever too late for anything. That seems a bit fatalistic.
Indeed, let's keep hope. Is somebody else does want to answer that question? Otherwise, we have another one.
I can maybe comment just really briefly on this. I think the way that I've been thinking about this is again in connection with communication and just how we communicate the relevance and the impact of these technologies. And I think Chris is exactly right that people are more prone to be alarmed or concerned about more visible manifestations like surveillance cameras, you know, and having to, you know, have their face scanned or something like this. It's much harder to articulate why, like, databases and the processing behind the scenes, behind the curtain of personal data is problematic. So, and I think even the way, again, we talk about these things, this horrible word interoperability, like even biometric data, like how do we talk about these issues in ways that get to what's problematic? And again, maybe like getting out of a very technical language that connects these more to these broader concerns, frankly, around democracy, you know, and around discrimination and policing. So I think a lot of it for me is trying to tackle this challenge of communicating to a broad public about these issues in a way that they can relate to. I think, of course, it's easier to relate once you can then say, well, this is a slippery slope, and eventually interoperability is now about foreigners. But 10 years ago, interoperability was unimaginable, and we can imagine certainly that this will extend in the next 10 years, or, you know, in the future, to implicate all, you know, European citizens. So that makes it more likely to resonate with people, but it's still, I think there's a fundamental communication issue around these more invisible technologies.
If I can just add, and there is, I think, an inherent tension here, and it's one that kind of keeps me up at night as well, as I'm thinking about how to frame certain issues or certain policy recommendations. Because I think there is a lot to be said, of course, and Alina, I know we talked about this already, about the contextual specificity when it comes to the way these technologies manifest in people's lives. And so, for example, oftentimes in the migration space, you see a clear demarcation between the refugee experience and everyone else. And for good reason, because of course, there's a completely different legal framework when it comes to refugee protection and the kind of necessities and needs that people have who kind of are part of that community. But on the other hand, I think when we're talking about some of these broader issues, these systemic issues about democracy, about representation, about power, about priorities, perhaps too much of kind of an atomization or a crystallization of these issues isn't effective either. So there is this kind of tension that even in our report, we really had to think about, do we focus it on a particular experience of migration, or do we talk about things from a more broader perspective? We, for example, elected to use the term people on the move as opposed to refugees and migrants and immigrants and, because anyone can be a person on the move. And then within that, you have contextual specificity. But all that to say, I think it is a tricky question about how do you effectively call for policymaking, regulation, etc., while recognizing that, of course, everyone's lived experience is different and people occupy multiple categories. And yet these issues already are affecting all of us and will continue to affect all of us. Just something to think about, perhaps from a more philosophical or methodology perspective.
Thank you. I think the answer plenty in a comprehensive manner the question. We have another question from Monica. She's asking about whether the Convention 108 plus of the Council of Europe and its additional protocol on facial recognition help in any way against the development of such AI systems in the field of law enforcement and migration. And she's asking about option to question those kind of uses of technology against migrant in court. So are there any kind of litigation ongoing that could help, if any of you know?
I can jump in if that's okay. So it's interesting that you bring up Convention 108. I think it's an instrument that a lot of people, myself included until very recently, didn't really engage with much, but we do, for example, call in our recommendations in our EDRI report for states to ratify and sign the convention. You know, I mean, maybe this sounds strange coming from an international human rights lawyer, but I think the Human Rights Project in and of itself, of course, is not perfect. And using international instruments to hold states accountable leaves many gaps. But I think there is something to be said about certain standard setting from the kind of top-down approach. So it definitely is an instrument that we've kind of started to use more and more in our policy conversations. And I am just blanking on the second part of that question. There was another thing I wanted to say. Chloé, could you just remind us what the full question was? Ah, yes. Yes. This is an interesting area. I can't speak too much about it just yet publicly, but I would say stay tuned. More and more of us are turning our minds to this particular venue in the coming years, I would say. It definitely is something that, of course, others, you know, in the UK context, for example, have tried to do. There's been a few cases of algorithmic discrimination that have been successfully challenged in courts across the world, but this is definitely a developing area that needs to be explored further. So I'm curious and excited to see where we will go with this in the next little while.
Teasing. Please stay tuned. Anyone else want to answer that? Something about like litigation?
I'll just add that there's been a few cases about facial recognition. I think the first one in the world certainly about the use of facial recognition by the police was in the UK. A guy called Ed Bridges he was scanned by South Wales police twice, once at a protest and once while he was maybe at a football match. So he took South Wales police to court for their use of their facial recognition system, which was like a watch listing kind of system. They had a list of alleged suspects or people of interest, and they would scan everyone in a certain location to see if they matched those people. He took them to court. It finally went to the Court of Appeal, where he semi-won. Basically what the court said was the right safeguards weren't in place. and that the police should have followed, it should have done a data protection impact assessment, etc., etc. And this is where, those are very important things, but I suppose this is where the legal avenue tends to lead. It's very unlikely, I think, that a legal challenge will overturn or rather lead to a moratorium or ban on facial recognition technology. I imagine it would just lead to a tightening on the conditions under which it could be used. And there's also been a case in France against the police by La Quadrature du Net, whose name I can't pronounce properly. Maybe Chloé can.
Yes, indeed. But those cases were related to courts, if I'm not to schools. Sorry, if I'm not mistaken, right? Was it like Sweden, where in Sweden it was the DPA, and in Marseille it was the administrative court, I think, who took it down. I don't have any more questions, and it's 42, and I don't want to run over this next panel. So I think I'll try to wrap it up from there. What I can take from this panel is that there is a need for us to think collectively about those issues, that we have several barriers on the way and obstacles. First and foremost, just the collection of information about what's going on. And I think some of you are doing just a great job at just putting of making this information available to the public and accessible. And so I'm really thankful for that. And I hope we can keep up the conversation in other channels. And yeah, I think I will stop here and leave the floor to the CPDP people. And thank you so much for the speakers who came today and contributed to this conversation. It was really great to have you guys, and happy to see your face from time to time.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.